Okay. All right. So welcome to round 2 of Mora Nevuchim, the guide to the perplexed, the guide for the perplexed. Last week, we read the letter that the Rambam wrote. The Rambam, I'm going to typically, because I'm more used to speaking and studying it in Hebrew, so I'm going to call him the Rambam, but just know that I mean Maimonides when I say that, because someone did ask me that question the other time. So I just want to make that clear. I'll try to throw in sometimes calling him by his English name just so that we all stay straight. But when Rambam wrote this book, he started with that letter that he wrote to his student, to whom this entire book is addressed. So we have to thank that student, Rabbi Joseph, for inspiring the Rambam to do this. And now today we're going to start with the introduction. And we'll see how much we can cover. I mean, there's so much in every line that this might go real slow, but I'll try to make it fun anyway. And please, if anyone has a comment or a question, part of the fun is the discussion, or the main part of the fun is the discussion. So let's do it. So whichever introduction you're starting with, whichever translation you're using, the Rambam starts with 3 psukim, 3 verses that he quotes. And I want to talk a little bit about them because from these verses, we can learn a lot. There's a lot to learn from these verses, and it's worthwhile paying attention to them. So the first verse that the Maimonides quotes is a verse from Tehillim, from Psalms 143, verse 8. And the verse reads as follows. It begins, Hashmi'eni v'boker chastecha. The psalmist, David, is addressing God, and he says, tell me in the morning your kindness, ki v'cha b'tachti, because I have had trust or faith in you. And then the rest of the verses, Maimonides quote, Hodi'eni derech zu elech. Let me know, teach me, or show me this path upon which I am going, or on this, or so there's various ways of translating that. Derech zu elech, this path which I am going on, or this path, which path should I go on? The Rambam, it seems, is more like the first translation that I just said. God, I need your help to give me knowledge because I'm going on this path, and this path is fraught and difficult. There's a lot of obstacles to learning, so it's a prayer. Take those obstacles away. Ki elecha nosasi nafshi. Why should you help me, God? Because my ultimate goal is to know you, is towards you, is to know you. And this is how I believe is the best way to translate that verse. And it tells us a lot about Maimonides and how he's about to go this book. He understands that this book is fraught with a lot of difficulty and it's going to be challenging, and he asks God for help. And then the next verse he says, and this is from Mishlei, Proverbs, chapter 8, verse 4. And here, I want to point out a few things. This chapter in Proverbs begins with verse 1, as the writer of Proverbs is speaking to wisdom, as if wisdom was a person or an angel, and he's speaking to wisdom. And he's speaking to wisdom as if wisdom, Chachma, was a woman. And he tells wisdom, Halo Chachma Tikra. Wisdom is calling out to us. Utuvuna, and understanding, Titain Kola, is raising her voice. Wisdom is speaking to us. He goes on describing this woman who's representing wisdom and understanding. And he describes her as Birosh Miromim Alei Darach. She is standing at the heights, all the way up. She's speaking to us, Beit Nitivot Misava. And she is speaking and standing at the crossroads. In other words, there's lots of people coming by, and she's on a high place speaking to us. Wisdom is speaking to us. Liad She'arim Lefi Kares. She's speaking near the gates at the city's entrance. Mevo Pesachim Tarona. She's shouting out at the doorways, at the entrances to the city. So the writer of Proverbs, King Shlomo HaMelech, is describing how wisdom is trying to talk to us. And then she says, and this is the verse that the Rambam quotes, Aleichem ishim ekra, I am talking to you, human beings. So she's screaming out and trying to get their attention. You have to imagine this image V'koli el b'nei Adam. And my voice is speaking to humanity. B'nei Adam is a language meaning all of humanity. Whenever the prophets speak about B'nei Adam, it's a reference to all humanity. So this second verse is very telling. So Maimonides first prays to God for help, right? Help that he can get this wisdom and have this right wisdom. And then second, he looks at all of humanity. He says, I am speaking to you people, and that's who I'm talking to. I'm talking to all of human beings. And then the third verse is also from Proverbs, but this time Proverbs 22. And Maimonides, Proverbs 22, verse 17. And then Maimonides pleads with the people that he's talking to. He's just trying to get our attention. And he says, Hat oznecha. Listen, literally, that means turn your ears. Ushima, and listen, divrei chachamim, to the words of the wise man. V'libcha tashis l'dati, and place your heart, in other words, pay attention to dati, to the knowledge which I am about to impart to you. So think about those words that the Rambam started off with before he even began. He prays to God for help and wisdom. He then looks at all of humanity and says, people, I'm speaking to you. Please listen up. And he, of course, quotes the prophets in order to convey his words beautifully and poetically. And with that, we can start the Maimonides introduction. So give me 1 second here. All right. So Maimonides starts off, and whichever translation you're looking at, the primary one that I'm actually reading from is the Hebrew Kapach, but I have the English Pines version as well. So the first purpose, the first reason why I'm writing this book, Maimonides says, is because I want to explain the meaning of certain terms that are written in the books of the prophets. Now, this sentence is like the most boring sentence and the most boring start to this big book. I remember when I was younger, the first time I opened this book, I was already bored. I said, oh no, if anyone thinks back, I mean, there are maybe a few linguists among us that found language and grammar to be an exciting subject in school. I would venture to guess that the majority of us find that to be quite a boring topic, and myself included. And the Rambam starts off by telling us that he's going to tell us about words. He's going to talk to us about the meaning of phrases and words. To make it worse, he's going to give us different categories of words. But I am going to take this boring words and make it a lot more interesting, because I want you to really understand why the Rambam starts this way and how incredibly cool it is that he starts the book off like this. And he starts off like this: the different words that are used in the books of the prophets, or the books of the prophecies. Some of these words are, and the first category is, in the English Pines, he calls them equivocal terms. In the Hebrew Kapach, he calls them shemot meshutafim, meaning they have many meanings. You have a term, and a term can have many meanings. And when this term is used, it could mean A, B, or C, and you have to figure out from the context which one it means. Now, in order to make this more interesting, I want to give you an example from later on in the book. If you can turn to part 1, right, which is the section that starts part 1 of the Guide to the Perplexed, chapter 12. If you can do that in the Pines version, it would be, if you're looking at the Friedlander online, you'll have to scroll forward to part 12. And if you have the Pines version, it would be page 38. I'm going to flip in the Kapach, and here he describes a term. And I want you to think about why this is important and why this is interesting. The Rambam is referring to the Hebrew term kima, that's kuf mem, which refers to standing. So lakum means to stand. Now, the Rambam this is an example of a shem meshutaf, an equivocal term, which is one of the categories of terms that the Rambam is saying. Now, the primary thing that anyone that's familiar with Hebrew thinks when they see the word kima is it means to stand. You know, if you go to Hebrew in Israel and someone yells kum, he means stand up, right? Or get up, right? So however, so that's typically what it means. And it's kind of like the opposite of sitting. So for example, the Rambam brings examples of lo kam v'lo zami menu. He didn't in Zechariah. When someone was saw a vision, but he didn't stand. He wasn't. It didn't make him stand up. He didn't. However, it also means yitzivut hadavar. The Rambam says, and this I'm reading from the Hebrew, but it could also mean making something stable and solid, right? So when it says for the following verse, Yakum Hashem et Devaro, God will solidify his word. So there, that same word kum doesn't mean to stand. It means God will establish his words. He will fulfill them. He will make them true. Or Vayokom Sede Ephron, where Abraham bought the field from Ephron to bury his wife. It says the field became established as Abraham's. So it's obvious that the same word, it's similar meaning to stand, but it also means to establish something as fact, right? And then he gives the Rambam goes on to give other examples. So I'm going to explain why this is so cool, because what the Rambam is telling us is follows. There are many times in the Torah where someone could be reading a phrase, and it says that God stood up. And someone who's not thinking that it's a shem meshutaf, that it's a word with many meanings, will read it a simple way. And most of us don't think this way because we know this already, because the Rambam taught us this for thousands of years. It became ingrained. But a simple person might see, and God stood up, and he's imagining, or she's imagining in their mind that there's a person and he's standing, right? So when they read the verse, they think that it means God stands. And then you can imagine what kind of a trail of errors that could lead to. So the Rambam says, because kima is a shem meshutaf, it's a word with many meanings, right? So if you understand that to begin with, then you look at the verse and you think to yourself, which one of those meanings is most appropriate in this context? And then you understand when it says that God got up, it doesn't mean that he stood, like he actually has feet that he stands on. But it means that God made something solid. He made something real, or whatever the context would explain. So this is the key. The reason why this is interesting is the Rambam is already dropping to us the key to how he's going to answer much more perplexing problems than that. That's an obvious example. But there's other places where we might actually make mistakes. And the Rambam is telling us, don't make a mistake. Think about what the word in this context means. It might not mean what you think it means. So that's the first category. The second category, the Rambam says, right, after the shem meshutaf, right? Wait, I'm sorry, I missed. And the Rambam then goes ahead to say, and those fools, in other words, those numbskulls out there, right, when they read these verses, they might interpret the word in the verse to mean one of those things, which it sometimes does mean, but they think in this verse it means this, and then they read that verse and they completely misinterpret it. And you can think of tons and tons of times that this happens. And as we go through this book, and it would be interesting for all of us to go back to open the Torah, any page, whatever page it is, read a verse and find an example where there's a word that has many meanings, and if someone uses the wrong meaning, it can completely mess up the entire meaning of the verse. Right? And someone could walk away thinking something completely crazy or outrageous or stupid, right? Another possible term is mehem mush alim, right? Is others, which in the Pines he calls this, the next category are derivative terms, which means that they really mean one thing. The word has one meaning. However, sometimes, and this time I want you to turn to page 1, chapter 6, which is not page 1, the first, section 1, chapter 6 of the Rambam, which in the Pines would be on page 31. Okay, so the Rambam gives an example here where the word is mushal, which is you call it derivative, which means that the word actually has a meaning, but occasionally it's used in a completely different context, because the verse wants to it means something else in this case, but it derives from the original meaning of the word. The verse chapter 6 has a very simple example. the word ish and isha in Hebrew, ish and isha means a man and a woman. It's referring to a human being. Ish meaning a human man, and a isha meaning a human woman. And however, by the Teva, when the animals were getting onto Noah's Ark, it says of every the verse reads that of every clean animal you should take 7 pairs, the man and his woman. It uses ish isha, right? Now, clearly it's talking about animals, and it's using a word that the literal translation is humans. So it's not calling the sheep animals, right? Obviously, it's mushal. It means man and woman, but you understand as you're reading this verse that here in this context, it's meant to be a derivative word. You're supposed to understand that it's referring to these animals as man and woman, even though they're not actually a man and woman. Now you can understand even more so how someone could be led to make an error sometime, right? And examples where it says something about God's, smoke coming out of his nose or something, like anger or something, where clearly it's not trying to. It's a language that's mushal. So that's an example of something that's mushal. And then the third one, so those are the second one. The other ones is what he calls in Hebrew, misupakim, which the Pines English calls amphibolous, which I don't really, I'm not that good of a linguist myself, but basically what that means is that the word could have many meanings, right? The word, it's not really clear what the word means, and at times you could think, right? If you're not careful, you can really get fooled and think it means something else. And sometimes you might think elsewise. It's easier to understand if you look at an example. And for here, an example, I want you to look at part 1, chapter 3. Okay, so part 1, chapter 3, Maimonides is going to bring an example of one of these examples, and he uses the Hebrew word Tumunat. Now, a Tumunat could be translated in many different ways. Generally, it means a figure, right? Sometimes it means, for example, I'm going to go to the Hebrew here. Sometimes the Tumunah refers to a, I'm sorry, just give me 1 second. It's literally refers to an actual shape. So you look at a building, let's say, the building has a shape, right? The building has a design. It's square. It has certain angles. It has a timunah. Sometimes the word timunah refers to a vision that someone has in a dream. And Maimonides gives an example. So it's actually referring to something that's not actually real. It's just a vision. And sometimes it refers to a plan, like how like it's a description of a shape, not a particular building with a shape. But so anyway, the bottom line is that so these are the 3 categories of words that the Rambam says, and I am going to explain to you how to read through the verses of the Bible. When you read the Bible, you need to understand that words can have one of these 3 meanings, and in order to properly interpret it, you need to get which of those 3 meanings. I want to stop for a second and take questions so far.
Could you go back and explain the difference between equivocal and this last example you gave?
So equivocal means the word, well, the way I understand it, it's hard to really get it, but the way I understand it is an equivocal term is that the word has several meanings. It could mean A, it could mean B, it could mean C, and all 3 are solid, well-known, well-established meanings. And you can look at the context and get right away what it's talking about. The last category, the word also has multiple meanings, but it's much less clear, which is why in Hebrew it's called a misupak. It's much less clear. You could read it either way, right? You could read it one way, you could read it the other way. With different ways actually will fit. So it makes it more difficult. It's easier to make a mistake. But they're similar in the sense that the word has different meanings. And that's the way I understand the difference. I'm glad you brought that up because it is a a tough difference. But when we go through, the Rambam is going to go through chapter by chapter, different examples. We'll see how it'll play out, kind of what I just described. The Shemot Mesupakim are words that are like it's really not clear, and you could really make a mistake or not. And the original one is much more solid. Any other
So
comments
where,
about the term?
yeah, where do homonyms fit into that? Are there the derivatives? Are they where, what category?
Well, so
Because
those are
when,
two
I'm
different
listening to
words,
sort of,
right? That mean the same thing, right? So,
all right, so that's what that means.
Right.
So which one of did you already cover that? But I didn't hear the word
no, because the
homonym.
Rambam is
So
really talking from the other side. One word that has many meanings, as opposed to many words that have the same meaning. The
okay,
Rambam is talking about, I read a verse, right? And I see a word, and it makes me think something that I find to be very strange, right? So the first key method that the Rambam is saying, in other words, it conflicts with something that's either obvious to me or something that I know to be true or something. It just doesn't sound right. So the Rambam says, one of the keys you need to know to understand it is look back at that word and think, are you truly translating it correctly? That word might have other meanings, right? And maybe in this context, it means something else. So this is the key. And this is going to be one of the major keys, what we're going to find, and we're going to read it soon. The Rambam is going to say, I'm not going to answer all your questions, right? But I am going to give you some answers to a lot of questions so that you can then go and study and learn on your own. When you learn another verse and say, oh, now I get it. Something that I never understood before, just didn't make any sense to me. All of a sudden it makes sense when I apply this method. So the Rambam says like that. I'm sorry, he said, so he hints to this right away. He says, it is not the purpose of this treatise to make, well, not exactly. I'm not trying here to explain everything to the general public, to what he calls the vulgar, the people that are just starting to learn, that really don't know knowledge, don't know anything. Now, remember that the Rambam was living in a time when the masses were generally uneducated. Today, most of us have an education. We think we know more than we do, but we generally know more than the average person back then. But so I'm not going to, people that don't understand, I'm not going to try to explain to them. That's not my purpose. And I'm not trying to explain this to people that are just starting to learn and just starting to gain knowledge. And I'm not trying to teach even people that have taught themselves or have learned a Torah, but the only Torah that they know is just the basic laws. They know basic halakha. They know I'm supposed to do this, not supposed to do that. If that's all the knowledge that they have, either worldly knowledge or Torah knowledge, this is not why I'm writing this book. They don't need this book. However, what my primary goal here is to, in writing this entire book, right, and everything that and everything that I write in this vein, the purpose of me writing this is so that people should know the Torah in truth, should know the actual meaning of the Torah. So my goal is, the Rambam says, which kind of person am I talking to? I'm talking to a person who is religious. Now, this is an interesting point here. I'm talking to someone who is religious. So what the Rambam is hinting at here is, this is not a book to defend religion. Even though he does do that at some points, he does go through the philosophy of religion. I'm not here to prove that God exists, or to prove that Judaism is the right path, or to prove that this religion is right or wrong or whatever. I'm here to talk to someone who is religious. You believe in God. You believe in this case, in the case of the readers of this book, I believe in Judaism, right? That's kranikva belibo. It's already in his heart, and he already knows in his mind, right, the truth of our Torah, right? We read the Torah, we know this is true, we know this is real, or at least the readers of this book. And he's showing bedato midotav, the Rambam says, right? And he is complete both in his knowledge and his belief, but he's also complete in his behavior. A good person, a solid person, a person whose inside is like his outside. And he also has studied the works of the philosophers, in which case Rambam means the Aristotelian philosophers, and he knows what they write, and he knows the truth of which they speak. And I want you to pay close attention, because what I'm reading now is I personally always found this mind-blowing. And then his mind, so he knows Torah and he knows what today we would call science, but then he called what the philosophers wrote. The philosophers led by Aristotle was the height of the knowledge of science in his time. So his human mind, his human mind has drawn him. In other words, his mind that's logical and philosophical and understands things has drawn him. And he wanted to know more and more about, like, go into the depths of science and know what's real, what's true. And then and then he looks in front of him, and starkly sitting in front of him is the simple writings of the Torah. He sees the verse as a simple writing, as a simple verse. And then when he doesn't understand something, right, or he misunderstands something because he looks at a term, one of those kinds of terms that I just talked about, a derivative term or an amphibolious term, a term that could mean many things, and he understood it in a way that makes no sense to him. Therefore, he will remain in a confused and perplexed and mind-blowing situation, because he's reading, he believes in God, he reads this verse, and what he's reading doesn't fit with what he knows from science and philosophy to be true. Think about this for a minute, because I'm going to open the floor in a second, and I'm going to want you to tell me examples of how this happens to you in our day, in our time. Our conflicts are different than the Rambam's conflicts, but we have today what we would call cognitive dissonance as well. A person who is religious and then studies the Torah finds something there that either scientifically makes no sense or doesn't seem right, or morally or ethically doesn't seem to work, doesn't make sense, doesn't fit, right? And so what are the choices the Rambam says? The person has two choices. One choice is he can go after his mind. He can go after what he knows to be true, the logic, the philosophy, the morals, the ethics, right? And then and he will then have to go ahead and he will abandon that which he understood when he read the Torah. He'll have to abandon it, and he will think by doing this that he just became an atheist, right? By going the way of logic and philosophy and contradicting what he thought he read in the Torah, he has now made himself into an atheist. And I want you to think, and he thinks, oh no, I just threw religion out the window. I was such a religious guy before. I don't believe in this anymore. One of the things that I've always believed is many people who claim to be atheists because they reject the Torah are atheists, not because they actually reject the Torah, but because they reject that which they think the Torah says. And that's exactly what the Maimonides is saying right here. That we think that by following logic and philosophy, we're throwing out the Torah, because when we read the Torah, we read it wrong. Okay, so that's choice A. Choice B is just as bad, but it goes the opposite. And that is, or he can continue thinking that the Torah meant what he thought it meant, and and forget about that which his brain said, that which logic said, that which his morals and ethics said, that which he thought was correct and true. But the Torah says like this, right? This is what it says. And then it comes out that he's turned completely backwards. He's turned away from his brain. He left his logic and mind behind. He went and he separated himself from logic. And he's going to think that he has just brought damage upon himself for learning science, right? He damaged that study of philosophy, ruined his religion, because he has to stick with the religion. But by studying philosophy, now he thinks it's true, but he's rejecting what he thought logically to be true because the Torah said otherwise. I think about this because it's so relevant to a lot of what goes on and what many of us have been through, myself included, during our own development and our lives, and continue to go through as we develop throughout our lives. You know, sometimes we wonder if all that knowledge we gained, right, did that ruin my religion? And sometimes we wonder, right, maybe my religion is bogus because I know from science that it's otherwise. So we can think about this. And what will happen if a person does this? If he goes with religion and forgets logic, he will remain with these with these imaginary ideas, the Rambam says, these imaginary ideas that he thinks are religion, right? But he's going to imagine them and remain with them in a state of pain, in a state of difficulty, because he's constantly, his entire life, he's going to have, his heart is going to hurt, and he's going to be confused, and he is going to be mivucha, he's going to be perplexed. So that is the first purpose why the Rambam is saying this. I want to open the floor for 3 examples. You guys, someone tell me 3 examples of where you might have gone through either one or 2 of those possible things. An example, a contradiction that you've had between what you knew to be true and what you thought the Torah said, and where you were forced to take either choice A or choice B. It doesn't matter to me which one you took. I want to open the floor and see what people have to say.
How about the sun stood still?
Okay, that's an excellent example, actually. That's a really good example. Thanks. The Maimonidean, obviously the Maimonides led an entire group of Jewish philosophers. The Maimonidean commentaries on Joshua actually explain that in a logical, non-miraculous way, but it's too much to get into now. If you want to listen to my podcast on Joshua, I actually go through the different ways of understanding that. But yeah, so which way did you choose, or did you not choose?
Well, can I just offer one? I don't know if this qualifies.
Okay.
What appear to be genocidal, what are genocidal passages in the Torah?
Very good, excellent. It's another excellent example. Actually, both of you are focused on the book of Joshua, because that's where a lot of that genocidal stuff is a problem. I suggest that you listen to my podcast on Joshua, because I deal with these issues directly. But my podcast is called "Let the Prophets Speak," and it's on the I go through the prophets, but those are both really good examples. So, but I like that one too because it adds another dimension, and that's the ethical dimension. In other words, something not just we logically think is wrong or scientifically think is wrong, which is really the first example of the sun standing still, but where we ethically think something's wrong. So, but it's really good. Okay, yeah. Any others? Let's have one more, and then we'll go on. Okay, go ahead. I saw. Yeah, go ahead. I'll unmute you. Okay. I think. Wait. I think you need to unmute yourself.
There we go. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
My background is in science, so I've always struggled with the creation story.
Well, that is excellent, and that's probably the classic. I figured that would be the first one that comes out. Now, Maimonides himself is going to deal a lot with the creation story. I mean, like a significant portion. We may even get to a touch of it today, but that's excellent, though. I mean, you know, how do you reconcile the story of creation with what we what we now know to have been the process of the creation or development of the universe, however you call it. That's obviously an excellent one. So those are 3 good examples. Let me see if I can take 1 or 2 more. I said 3, but they're interesting. So what else is anyone thinking?
I have a real concrete one.
Okay, go ahead.
And Reuven slept with his father's concubine. We just learned that in Daf Yomi.
Yes, that's a good one. That's a very good one. That's very ethical. There's no it's completely understandable on a human level how such a thing can happen, but it's hard for us to reconcile our image of the
yeah, but we learned in Daf Yomi that Rashi says, oh no, it meant that he just put his bed into her room.
Right. But meanwhile, that's not what the verse actually says.
That's not what I thought.
Right. So yeah, and there are other parts of the top. So that's a very good one. That's another example. That's a purely ethical one, right? In other words, like how do we reconcile the deeds of people that we assumed to be great people, but they do something so despicable? Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one.
How about an eye for an eye?
An eye for an eye. Excellent. Very good. Right. That's really good. And there actually, that's a good example because the Talmud, when it qualifies that and it means the payment for an eye rather than an actual eye, actually goes through this Maimonidean process of trying to prove why ayin doesn't really mean an eye, but it means something else. That would be a shem shutaf. That would be a word that has multiple meanings, right? So I like that example because it actually, that's where you can see that Maimonides is not completely brand new. The process that the Talmud goes through that process too. And you have one more before Jeff? Go ahead.
I would say the institution of slavery is something obviously that
Yes.
in a contemporary mindset we reject. And within that, the differential treatment between Jewish and non-Jewish slaves.
Both extremely good ones. Extremely good ones. And thank you for bringing them up. I see that we're zeroing in on, we started with the miraculous issues and we're zeroing in on the ethical ones. And the ethical ones are tougher, but not impossible. And Rambam will deal with those ethical questions too. Obviously, he had different ethics than us. So for the Rambam, it was easy to say that women are inferior to men. And the Rambam, it was easier to say that blacks were inferior to whites. The Rambam is famous for saying these things because in his world, it seemed to him obvious that way, right? In our world, it's obvious not that way, right? But he does set in motion a lot of things that that help us, that give us guidance. And through this book, we'll see them, the things that he already knew to be or understood to be ethically wrong with the Torah, including a little bit genocide, and we'll get there. So, but all of these are good, and this is when the Rambam is going to say in one or two paragraphs, which we might get to tonight. You know, he's giving us little drops. He's going to give us little bits and pieces, so that we have guidance to know how to get to the answers. But he's not going to always go all the way to the end of the answers. But all of these are really good because I see that everyone gets it, and why I love this book, and why now we understand that even though he started off with what sounded like a boring topic of meanings of words, that is actually the key to how to learn. When you learn, or worse, think, what is it actually saying? And sometimes you're going to raise, oh, that's not what it meant. It means this, you know, and that's one of the major keys. But I do want to do a little bit more because there's a lot of good stuff. So then in the next paragraph, so that's purpose number one in writing the book. But I also had another reason for writing this book, and that is and this is to explain when strange parables in the Torah or the words of the prophets come up, when something is written and the meaning is very strange. Now the Rambam is thinking about things like the sun standing still, right? It doesn't seem, you know, to us. And the Rambam says it would seem to a fool and an idiot. I mean, I'm telling you, the Rambam uses very graphic terms, and when they translate it into Hebrew and English, they try to numb them, like tone them down a little bit. But the Rambam was clearly not very happy with the people that do this. So it seems to us a fool and an idiot that they interpret them by their simple meaning as if there's no hidden meaning behind, right? But if a person who is truly intelligent would actually think, if a person who's truly intelligent would think that they mean what they actually say on the surface, then he would be really stuck and perplexed, the Rambam says. However, if we were to explain to this intelligent person the parable, right, or we will wake him up to the fact that this is only a parable, then he would understand it and he would find a proper path, and we will save him from that perplexed status, that perplexed place where he is. And for this reason, I decided to call this book the Guide for the Perplexed, because people sometimes read the Torah with thinking that it means exactly what it says, and they and it's just clearly not the case. And then the Rambam says, and I want to go through this, and I'm not going to answer all of right now in the Pines, I'm up to the words, I do not say that this treatise. It's like the second or third paragraph on page 6. I'm looking at the Hebrew, but I have the English Pines in front of me too. And if you're following in the Friedlander. I don't know exactly what words is, but it's probably, you can probably follow where I'm up to, I hope. I'm not saying that I'm going to answer all the questions, right? I'm going to answer every question, for people that really want to know all the answers. But what I am saying is that I'm going to answer most of these questions. And what the Rambam means is most of the questions that he had then, we might have more questions today because we have a more scientific knowledge today. But I'm going to answer most of the questions and the hardest ones. I'm going to tackle some big ones. That's basically what the Rambam is going to say. Now, I'm going to give you a hint. In the Rambam's time, the biggest question was the issue of anthropomorphism. And that is the description of God as if he was a human being, which is found throughout the Bible from beginning to end a bazillion times. And this was a major issue for the Rambam because in the Rambam's world, the stupid idiots used to think that God is actually the proverbial old man sitting on a throne in the sky. And the Rambam needed to get rid of that notion. And he wanted to tell people, Jeff, do you want to say something? Your hand is up, or is it just from before?
I had a question, and
ahead.
maybe this is something we'll get to down the road, but it
Yeah.
seems to me that inherent in this process is the question, how does he decide what is to be explained figuratively versus literally?
So he's gonna, that's a really, really good and very important question. And the Rambam is gonna get into the details through his examples of how you make those decisions. And sometimes the Rambam might make decisions that someone else might disagree with, but he's gonna give us some guidance as to doing that. But the key here is that he's telling us that you have not just you have the license to, but you have to do that process. When you encounter something that makes no sense, you need to go through this process. Now, and then he says, and don't expect me every time, if you're an intelligent person and you're listening to me, don't expect me to explain everything all the way to the end. Explain it all out. Or if I start explaining some type of, I start explaining a certain chapter in the prophets, and I start explaining what the parable really is, don't expect me to finish going through every single verse of the entire parable and explain what each and every single reference is referring to. Because that's impossible to anyone. Even if we're standing here talking to each other in a conversation, the Rambam says, if we're talking to someone, it's very hard to explain that in a lecture, let alone in a book. This is what the Rambam says. So, and if I would write it, right, and this is, I'm going to end here, then and I hopefully open for more discussion. If I would write it, then stupid people every stupid person that reads this book will think that he knows everything because I read the book, so I know it all. Now we're all very, I think of the famous quote, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. We all know people that they take a college course on subject XYZ, right? Or they read a book, maybe it's a good book, and now they know everything there is to know on the subject. And if you're sitting around the table with them, they are the authority on whatever, because I read the book. And they're always saying, if I were to write in this book, and explain everything, then whoever read this book would think they know everything. So, and that I can't tolerate stupid people like that. And therefore, I'm not writing that way. I'm telling you right now that you're not going to know everything when you read this book. I'm just going to start explaining things. I'm going to answer some big questions. And even those questions, I'm not going to explain it all the way. So I think it's a good stopping point, because I think 45 minutes is a good time, but it's a great time to open up the floor for discussion. So anyone want to comment? It could be on anything that we covered. Just to remind you, we covered the different types of phrases, which is the key. We just talked about how a person can make two choices when they're left with a quandary like this, when they're perplexed. They could throw out the religion and keep the logic. They can throw out logic and keep religion, and both ways are no good. And then he discussed how he's not going to answer all the questions and not going to, and the fact that that the Torah often writes in Mishalim in parables. So let me go ahead if anyone wants to say anything. I think Jeff's hand is still up, but I don't think he means to say anything. But anyway, is there another hand?
Yeah. Can you give
Okay, go ahead.
Can you give an example of what you mean by not explain? Can you give one example of what you mean by Maimonides not explaining something completely all the way to the very end.
Well, it's going to happen a lot when he talks about spiritual concepts, like when he talks about the descriptions in Ezekiel about the throne of God, right? So the Rambam is going to give us a few hints as to what it means when it says there's the blue stones and God, and actually Ezekiel goes to the point of even describing God as a man on a chair. That's where that image comes from, right? Why does it look like a man? Why these kinds of things? The Rambam is not going to go into the detail of every influence and every single piece of those verses in Ezekiel and tell us what they're all referring to and try to make them something that would make sense. But he gives you like approaches and ideas that take it down from being this very, very anthropomorphic image and makes it into basically the forces that govern the universe is essentially the thrust of what he says. But we'll get there. It's going to be a while till we get there, but we will.
So the ordinary understanding, if you just read the ordinary text in translation of the Bible, you would be seriously misled into thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I would tell you, go ahead and read Ezekiel chapter 1, right? And pretend you're a dumb fool, right? Like the Rambam says, and read it literally, and then you'll understand how each verse will lead you to at least 12 different heresies from a religious angle, and 12 different logical, philosophical, and scientific bunches of nonsense on a different angle, right? So it'll hit you both ways. Religiously, it just doesn't jive with what you understood God to be, and on one hand, and on the other hand, scientifically, it clearly makes no sense at all. So it warrants a lot of explanation. The Rambam is we're gonna, well, I don't want to give away everything for next week, but that's just the biggest glaring example of where he doesn't go all the way to the end. But on almost every subject, he gives you a taste, and then he moves on to the next subject, and then he gives you a taste. That's how the book is designed. Anyway, does that answer?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. All right.
So have there been scholars that have, I'm sure, over the centuries of the years that have, read this or studied this and then written on, oh yeah, it doesn't mean what I thought or what we thought all along, and these are some.
Well, there's after Maimonides, there's Maimonides became almost he started the school of Maimonideans, right? The Maimonidean, whenever you pick up a Tanakh, if you get the standard traditional Jewish Tanakh with Makrot Gedolot, the one that our grandparents had in Europe, there are on the page, there are some commentaries that follow the non-Maimonidean path and generally interpret things much more literally, or use other rabbinic tricks to try to understand things, or rabbinic traditions in some cases. Rashi would be a very classic example of a non-Maimonidean commentary. And on the same page, you have the Ralbag, who's known as Gersonides, and you have Evan Ezra, and you have the Radak, who will very often take a very Maimonidean approach. There are other commentaries, authorities who kind of combine the two. The famous thing is that it was the Raavad who was one of who didn't like what Maimonides said, because he said that even though he agrees with the Rambam in principle, specifically about the issue of anthropomorphism, the Raavad felt that if a person were to think that God actually has an arm and a face and like a human being, that wouldn't be heresy. Maimonides would say, because at least he's reading the verses and he's translating them. Maimonides would have went bonkers if someone told him that. That's like the ultimate heresy in Maimonidean theology. But yeah, the Maimonides became really the defining rationalist in all of Jewish scholarly history. So there are those that were not and those that are. And to this day, you have these two schools. They're not really two, there's like a million, and there's a lot in between. But Maimonides is the main rationalist. Anyway, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, good. Any other comments before we close up for today?
Billy had a question.
I did. I was going to ask if he's going to get into kind of the intricacies of like words when there's like a double entendre or a triple entendre, where the word is being used specifically to kind of drag you in two different directions on purpose.
There will be some. I can't think of one right now, but there will be many examples where the Rambam will say it'll be a shame. A shame that's borrowed. Like the simple example is the ish v'isha on the animals, right? Why the Torah chose to use man and woman when referring to the animal, but in that specific case, the Rambam kind of just gives it kind of short shrift. But there are other places where like so if you would kind of do what you're trying to do, right, or suggest, would be to say something like, why did the Torah choose to describe animals as a man and a woman? Was the Torah trying to hint to us that the emotions that animals experience, as a couple, that has some value, and we should give it some value, just like we should give value to a human relationship? Maybe the Torah used those terms for a reason. When it said to save the animals as couples, right? It deliberately chose to use a human term, right, in order to bring us to another meaning, right? It didn't just to use it randomly. So the Rambam doesn't say what I just said, right? But that kind of thinking will pop up, and that's very good. I can't think of one that he uses right offhand, but I do know that we will encounter them.
When you look at classical Christian approaches to the Hebrew Bible,
Right.
particularly evangelical approaches,
Uh-huh.
they're almost always very, very literal.
Uh-huh.
Indeed, a lot of the biggest political issues of our time come from literal readings of the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. And
I take it
and you did-
Maimonides has not made much of an incursion into
no, he didn't.
Christian or Muslim thought.
I'm not criticizing any specific thinker right now, but you heard the kind of terms that the Rambam uses for people that interpret the Bible that way. So I don't, without saying it out loud, you don't need to read between the lines that much. He literally thinks that's fill in the blanks. He uses very, very dramatic terms to describe someone who reads the Bible that way. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just clarify, because I thought you said something that confused me a little bit. The pshat is, do they all maintain that the pshat absolutely has to make sense, just that there are oftentimes multiple, higher dimensions, you might say, of understanding, drush, remez, etc., but that pshat must always be at least rational? Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, that's very correct. I'm glad you said that. Now, the Rambam is clear in saying that you and I, and even the Rambam, may not get to that point of full understanding of it. But it does have to make sense, and it's our job to try to make sense of it. The third section of the book, Moreh Nevuchim, is where the Rambam goes through the laws of the Torah, which otherwise seem to be nonsensical, right? In some cases, and tries as hard as he can to explain it. And the Rambam goes at length, deals with this very issue. So he fundamentally begins with the assumption that everything does make logical and scientific sense, right? And we should try to figure it out. And the Rambam does try to figure it out, in some cases successfully, at least to the Rambam, in some cases unsuccessfully. But he never accepts that something doesn't make any sense at all. He might accept that he didn't understand it or he didn't get it, but there is an explanation. And that's really crucial. And one of the things that the Rambam does is he gives us the ability to continue his quest, right? After you read this book, he tells us, in almost every paragraph that we left, he tells us, I'm only going to start you. I'm going to give you a little. I'm going to give you a hint. I'm going to give you an idea. I'm going to show you how. But he doesn't say that I'm going to get you all the way to the end, right? Implicitly and explicitly, he's telling us that it's our job to keep going. And that's a very good point. I'm glad you raised that.
I just,
go ahead.
one last question. Does that mean if we stick with this for another couple of years, we're going to understand the red heifer? Is that what we're to read from your
We'll
last
deal with
comment?
that. The red heifer shows up in this book, yes, but at the rate we're going, that'll be in. God help me, I should live for another 30 years, and we'll be there. But no, there are going to be points of the book that go a little faster. When he does specific examples, we can run through some of them. We may even skip some of them, and I might, just to move along. And also when he gets deep into his debates with Muslim philosophers, and there be points where I might decide to jump past them, or we can debate then if we want to go into it, because he has this bone to pick with the Mutakalamun, which is the group of Muslim philosophers, and he's constantly there's parts of the book where he goes on and on and on, and we might choose to jump over it, but we'll see. Anyway,
What I found interesting in sort of the intro to this is the barriers to entry that he has established for someone to even begin to study what he is writing about. There's a certain, it felt a little bit like the Kabbalah as far as age was concerned. You had to be past family, you had to be past children, you had to be past all this. But then you had to start with logic, and then you had to go through the basics of mathematics, and then you had to go to philosophy, and then you had to go to metaphysics. I mean, it was, he was writing for an audience of one, as far as I can tell.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he decided this student had reached the point where
he can get it. So
Yeah.
so this is really important. I'm glad you brought that up too. Maimonides there are so many things that we can gain from this book, and there's so many things, but he was absolutely an elitist, and he was a sexist and a racist, right? But in his class, in his time, right, it's understandable. We have to understand him in this context. He was, people are going to say what I just said, and someone's going to really jump on me, but it's true. But elite, and he truly did not believe that the masses were capable of understanding these things. On the other hand, and let me say this, there are many scholars who point out that as you read through the book, there are many places, and try to take notice of some of these, where clearly he is addressing simple people. And I'll give you one example from today. The Rambam deliberately chooses the verse when he talks, the introductory verse, when he talks about, when he references that chapter from Mishlei, from Proverbs, of a woman who is representing wisdom and understanding. And this woman was calling out, who did she say she's speaking to? Alechem ishim ekra v'koli el b'nei adam. I'm talking to all human beings. If you look at that whole chapter, she's standing at the gateways of the cities. She's standing at the crossroads of the streets. She's standing on the high places where the masses are gathered beneath her so that they can listen and hear. So the Rambam clearly had this vision that he's talking to the masses of the public, and deliberately chose a verse that refers to all of humanity, B'nai Adam. So, but that's just one example that we did today, but we'll find examples that despite his elitism and despite his constant claims that he's only speaking to the select few wise people, there are other places where it seems like, he seems to be deliberately talking to everyone here. So, but on the other hand, he is an elitist. So I just, and it comes out. I mean, you get it. And today, when we all grow up in the United States of America, all men are created equal, and this is like, this is our bones, this is our heart, this is our soul. That's the ethics, that's the morals that we want and believe in. Sometimes it grates on our ears to hear what he has to say. But we'll see. Some people might yell at me and say, "Oh, you should never give this class because the Rambam said it's only for smart people." What if there's some dumb people in the class? I don't know. I think we're all smart. I think we'll be all okay. Any other comments, questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Yes,
Yes.
This
All
was
right, you're welcome.
wonderful. Thank you so
thank you.
much.
All right. You're very welcome, and have a wonderful
Good
evening.
night,
and
everybody.
Night,
See everyone
thank
next
you.
week. Be well.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.